All right, well, we got a cozy group here tonight, so we're going to take advantage of that because you can do different things with a smaller group. And what we're going to do is we're going to really burrow down into some understanding that I think will be enlightening for you. It certainly was for me when I discovered these ideas, and I think you guys are going to find something here in Ayn Rand's ideas, which are the ideas that I'm going to be presenting, of course, in my own words, but they're basically coming from her. But before we get started, let's do a little bit of a survey. Who thinks that rights exist, that we have rights? Okay, so that's pretty good. You know, I think it was 100% here, and that's good. My next question is, who thinks that they come from God, that rights come from God? Okay, we got one. Who thinks that rights come from government? And who thinks that rights come from nature? Okay. Who thinks rights come from someplace I haven't named yet? All right, we got 2, 3. All right, good. My question, had we gotten some people who didn't think that we had rights next, would simply be, do you think that liberty is good? And do you think that people should be free? Politically and economically. And normally, the people who don't think that we have rights, or don't think that rights are real, will say, or at least many of them will say, yeah, liberty is good and people should be free. But what I like to do there is remind them that the words good and should are moral terms. They're moral terms. If you say people should be free, and you put the emphasis on free for freedom, or you know, liberty is a good thing or whatever, then you can see there's a political element. Liberty and freedom are political issues. But if you put the emphasis on good or should, you can see that we are talking about something that is rooted in morality. And this is where we have the question, well, if it's true that liberty is good, if it's true that people should be free, then there must be some moral principle by reference to which that is true. Things aren't just good or you know, proper for human beings apart from some kind of a standard or a principle. There's got to be something by reference to which that is the case. Now, historically, the principle, the moral principle by reference to which it is true that people should be free or that liberty is good or anything in those terms, is the principle of rights. It's the principle of rights. And the principle of rights, as the founders put it, the US founders put it, is essentially this. It's the idea that you have a right to, or a moral prerogative, to act as you see fit in order to live. You have a moral prerogative to act on your judgment without being coerced by others. That's the right to liberty. You have a right to produce and keep and use the product of your effort. That's the right to property. And you have a right to pursue the values that you think will fill your life with joy. That's the pursuit of happiness. And observe that all of these rights, these kinds of rights that we're talking about here, involve verbs. You have a right to act on your judgment, to keep, use, and dispose of the product of your effort, to pursue happiness. So the kinds of rights that we're talking about tonight, I want to separate these from what are sometimes called positive rights, the idea that you have a right to goods or services, right? If you have a right to a home or a right to education or medical care or whatever, that implies that somebody else is going to have to provide that for you, right? And so there's really a contradiction there. But there's no contradiction, at least no inherent contradiction, in this idea that you have a moral prerogative to act on your judgment or to pursue your values, right? So that's the theory of rights that I want to zero in on. And the big question is it true? In theory, we have these rights. In theory, I have a right to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. But that's just a theory. If it's not supported by evidence, then it's just a floating theory. There's no reality to it. So where is the evidence? How do we know that we have rights? What are the facts that we can point to in support of this idea? Now, traditionally, there are 3 approaches to this. Did my mic cut out? Are we good? We're good? All right. There are three approaches to this idea. Many people, and this is very typical of conservatives and Republicans in America, think that rights come from God, right? A lot of other people think that rights come from government. This is very popular on the left in America. They think, yeah, whatever Congress votes into law and the president signs, those are your rights. And then a lot of people, particularly in the libertarian movement and in sort of just the freedom movement more broadly, think that rights somehow come from nature. So we're going to look at all three of these. Rights come from God, rights come from government, and rights come from nature. And there really are problems with each of these, including the nature one, which is surprising to a lot of people, but we're going to dig into it because that's where the rubber's going to meet the road here. So we'll start with the idea that rights come from God. If rights come from God, in order to prove that we have rights, what's the first thing you're going to have to prove? That God exists, right? This is a very tall order. Regardless of where you stand on whether or not God exists, there's no evidence for his existence. This is why religions hold that faith is a virtue. Faith and reason are sort of opposing concepts. If you believe something on the basis of evidence and logic, that's believing on the basis of reason. To believe something in the absence of evidence in support of that thing, that is to believe by faith. And there is no evidence for the existence of God, which is why nobody's ever presented it. And that's why the religions, all three of the major monotheistic religions, but religions generally who hold that there's a God, hold that faith, at least in some form, is a virtue, like you're supposed to have faith. The problem with accepting that rights come from God is that the only people who are ever going to agree with you are people who have faith, A, and B, if they have faith that their God tells them that they have to make you believe in their God, and if you won't, they're going to behead you or the like, then you have that problem because, and we know that that's serious business. I mean, I can make light of it here a little bit, but it is not a light thing. It's a very serious business. So the idea that rights come from God is problematic on multiple levels, not the least of which is that there's no evidence for the existence of God, so then you don't have any evidence for the existence of rights, and you're just like, well, it's just a claim then. And also, if faith is a means of knowledge, and that's the thing you're calling your means of knowledge, you're in really deep water, because that means that anybody who has faith that he should do anything to you has knowledge that he should do that thing to you. If faith is a means of knowledge, it's a means of knowledge. So if I have faith that I should fly jets into your skyscrapers, if you're an infidel country, then I know that I should do that. You see the problem with faith as a means of knowledge. So it's a very, very broad problem. This is not going to work to support rights, the idea that faith is the source or that religion or God is the source of rights. So a lot of people say, all right, well, that's not going to work. Well, rights really come from government. The government makes laws, and then whatever those laws are, they tell you what your rights are. And this sounds, to some extent, plausible until you realize that what's really happening here is the people who claim this are conflating laws with rights, and laws and rights are not the same thing. Governments do create laws, and they enforce those laws, and if you break those laws, then you will be punished by the government. That's the way that works. But the whole purpose of the concept of rights is that it's supposed to precede laws. It's more fundamental than law. The purpose of rights is to inform us and to inform governments and lawmakers what laws are legitimate and what laws are not. This is a more fundamental concept. That's why we have the concept of rights. Otherwise, we just have the concept of law. Moreover, if rights come from the government, if laws and rights are the same thing, that means that your rights are whatever the government says. So if you live in Nazi Germany and you're Jewish, then your right is to walk into this oven and be burned. This is not going to work for rights either. This is just an insane way of looking at rights, and it's just conflating two concepts that are really different and need to be kept apart. As the Founding Fathers put it, governments are formed not to create rights, but to secure them. That's the difference here. So this brings us to the issue of maybe rights come from nature. And that sounds really good if you can prove it. And if we can't prove it, then we're just making assertions, right? So where is the evidence in support of this idea that I have a moral prerogative to act on my judgment for my purposes, to keep and use the product of my effort, to pursue my own happiness, to live my life according to my own lights, my own mind, my own thinking? Where is the evidence? Well, if you cut me open, you're not going to find rights in here anywhere. They're just not here. And if you go, I'm not suggesting that you do cut me. And if you go looking out there, you're not going to find right. You're not going to find it under a rock or around the corner. They're just not out there. Rights are abstractions. They're concepts. So they're not out there anywhere. So where's the evidence for them? This is why if you press people who claim that rights are natural, what you typically hear is what you would hear if you pressed either John Locke or the Founding Fathers, who believed that rights were somehow natural. And you say, well, okay, if they're natural, where is the evidence for them? They'd say, well, they come from natural moral law. You go, okay, well, where does the natural moral law come from? And you know where Locke and the Founders eventually go with this. They say, this natural moral law comes from God. In other words, natural rights theory is not really natural rights theory, it's supernatural rights theory, just one step removed. That's not going to do. If rights come from God, you still have to prove that God exists, and you also have all the other problems that come along with that. This is why, famously, Bentham, Jeremy Bentham, famous utilitarian, said that rights are nonsense upon stilts. And it's why the British philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre said, the idea of rights, the idea of imprescriptible rights or inalienable rights, the rights that the Founding Fathers spoke of, he says, that idea is one with witches and unicorns. It's in the same category as witches and unicorns. Why? Because there's the exact same amount of evidence to support their existence. So rights just don't exist on this idea. Well, this is a real problem because our freedom is based on this idea of rights. Now, some libertarians, apparently not you guys, but some libertarians think that that's not true, that our freedom is based on either the axiom of non-aggression or some other thing. But again, if you're in discussions with people about this and you ask them, well, wait a minute, before we talk about axioms of anything, let's just get clear on something. Is it true that people should be free? And as soon as they are using should and good language, they are using moral terminology. They are claiming that there is some moral principle. And the non-aggression axiom is not a moral principle. It's just an assertion that you should not use force against people. Okay, where did that should come from? How do we know that is true? It's just not, if it's not supported, it's not supported. So Ayn Rand comes to this sort of context in the history of philosophy. You have these basic three ideas out there, God, government, or nature somehow, yet we know not how. And no one has proven, up to the point where she got interested in this subject, that we have rights. And what she did is she stepped back and took a very different approach to rights than anyone else had. She didn't look out there and grab one of these theories and say, I'm going to run with it. She instead basically said, what are rights? Do we need them? And if so, why? What are rights? Do we need them? And if so, why? This is basically the method that Rand used for everything. When she wanted to discover what is true in morality, she asked, what is morality? Do we need it? If so, why? Or values. What are values? Do we need them? If so, why? And this is just a beautiful thinking tool of Rand's. I teach this in various courses that I teach, how powerful this tool is. But we're going to look at it now. So what are rights? Do we need them? And if so, why? By answering these questions, if there are reasons that we need rights, those reasons are going to point to the facts of reality that give rise to the concept of rights. In other words, they're going to tie rights to observable reality. And we're going to see how that works right now. So we've got this idea of rights. We've got this moral prerogative to act on our judgment, keep, use, and dispose of the product of our effort, and so on. All right, do we need that? That's what they are. That's the theory. Do we need it? And if so, why? All right, so Rand says, well, what kind of animal are we talking about here? What are we as human beings? And here she takes a very Aristotelian approach. She looks at human beings. She says, well, what is it that makes human beings distinct? Well, we have this faculty of reason. That's what distinguishes us fundamentally from all other living things. This faculty of reason is our means of looking at reality, integrating what we see into concepts, forming generalizations and principles, and thereby understanding the world and how we can put things together and build things, including everything from fires to huts to automobiles to satellites, to governments that are limited, to rockets to defend us against attackers and everything else and everything in between. Reason is the faculty that enables us to do this. This is what distinguishes us from all of the other animals. Reason, she observes, is our basic means of living, because it's the means by which we understand reality and figure out what things are and put them together, A. And B, more fundamentally than just being our basic means of living, it's our means of knowledge, which is why it's our basic means of living, right? It's our means of learning about reality. We're not born with knowledge. A deer comes out of its mother and it has instincts to learn how to run and follow its mother and stick with the program that enables it, hopefully, to avoid getting eaten by a predator. We don't have that. We come out of the womb with a potential, but no innate knowledge at all. Birds, all of the other animals have some kind of an innate knowledge. It's born in them. We don't have that. We have to learn, and we have to use our minds to do it. And then, crucially, as we figure out what's true in reality, and as we figure out the factual requirements of our life, we have to be free to act on our judgment. Well, first of all, we have to act on our judgment. Let's set the freedom point aside for a minute. I jumped the gun there. We have to act on our judgment. You can't just sit around and think and live by thinking. That's not going to work, right? You have to convert your thought into action. You have to get out in the world and figure out, oh, if I need food, clothing, and shelter, I need to put these things together in this way and produce that. Then you can perhaps trade some of those things with other people who have produced that. You guys know economics, so I'm not going to go too deeply into that. But this applies not only to physical goods, it applies to spiritual values as well. Self-esteem, romance, friendship, the things you get from enjoying art. You watch a movie and it fills your soul with either joy or perhaps sorrow, depending on the art. But art is a spiritual thing. By spiritual, in the objectivist context, in Rand's context, we mean it pertains to consciousness. It pertains to the mind and to your values, your chosen values. So even in those areas, how do you figure out how to make a good relationship work? You're not born with that knowledge. You have to think. You have to observe. Well, what is a relationship, and what are people, and what is a girl and a guy like, and how's this going to work for me, and who am I interested in, why? All of those questions are thought processes that you go through to figure this out. So we have to use reason in order to live, and we have to act on reason in order to live. If you place yourself on a desert island and just imagine no one else is there, what do you have to do in order to live? Well, you're going to have to figure out how to make food, make a shelter to keep yourself safe from any predators, and so on. But suppose a brute rose up to the island and he straps you to a tree. Now, today you had planned to work on the shelter you were working on and maybe try to fashion a fishing hook to catch some fish. Can you do that now? You're strapped to a tree. No. So the brute's force has come between your mind, your thinking, and your ability to act. He's disrupted the link between the mind and action, between the mind and reality, the things you have to do in order to live. In other words, his force has disabled you from using your fundamental means of living, your mind. You can't use it now. If he lets you go from the tree and tells you that you're free to wander the island, but anything you produce belongs to me, and if you don't give it to me, I'll strap you back to the tree and let you die. Now are you free? Well, it depends on what you mean by free. You're free to wander around, but are you free to act on your judgment, produce, use the thing? No, you're not free to do the things you actually need to do to live. You're still in essentially the same position you were strapped to the tree, except maybe you can get a club and hit the guy or something. But moving on, Let's say he says, and this guy's much bigger than you for the sake of the story here. So you don't have the ability to defend yourself against him. Now he says, all right, well, you may keep 30% of what you produce, but the rest of it you have to give to me. What are you now? We have terms for these things. You're a serf, right? Or a slave, depending on how you want to define these things. This is not a human life. This is not a human life. Force, to the extent that it is used against you, whether you're strapped to the tree or whether there's a threat of force, which is force because it's real and it makes you unable to act on your judgment as you see fit. In any event, when force is used against you and to the extent it's used against you, you cannot live as a human being. Now, this is just an isolated way to look at what force is. If we come back to civilization, none of this changes. The use of force against you in civilization has the exact same effect as it does when you're on the island. If you're thrown into a cage in civilization, you can't act on your judgment. If you're walking to the store and a thief jumps out from behind a dumpster and puts a gun to your head and says, give me your wallet or your purse, your alternatives become either die or give this guy your money. If you give him your money and he runs away, can you do the thing that you were planning on doing that day with that money? No, the money's gone. You might have other money you could go get and go to the store and buy things, but you can't buy things with the money that's gone. Why? Because force has come between your mind and your choices and your actions in life. You can't act on your judgment. This is what force does. You can take multiple examples of this. Think of a woman in Afghanistan who wants to sell scarves for a living. So she thinks, oh, I'll sell some scarves. Women like to buy scarves. I'll make some and we'll go outside and offer them for sale. And then the Taliban man comes along and says, you're a woman. You're not allowed to sell scarves. Get back in your house. You're not allowed out of your house without a male escort. Is this woman free? The Taliban's going to punish her, put her in jail, rape her, kill her. Who knows what they're going to do? They do whatever they want to do. So is she free to live as a human being? No. So the threat of force in any way, in any place, at any time, stops human beings from acting on the one thing that makes them human, the judgment of their mind. And this is why slavery is wrong. So if this wasn't true, if it wasn't true that stopping someone from acting on his own judgment and pursuing his own happiness and keeping and using the product of his own effort, if it wasn't true that that's wrong, then slavery wouldn't be immoral. It wouldn't be wrong. It would be fine. So on one level, we all know that there's something going on here. But what we need to do is codify it into a principle. And this is what Ayn Rand has done. She's looking at this fact about the relationship between force and human life and realizing that when force is used, and to the extent that force is used against the human being, it stops him or her from acting on his or her fundamental means of living, the judgment of the mind. This is what Rand observes as the basis for the concept of rights. And look at the difference here between this and rights come from nature, we know not how, right? You're going to just say they come from nature, but nobody can really put their finger on it. Well, what's going on here? And the way I like to think of it is this. Yes, it's true that rights are in the mind. It's a concept, just like humor or sarcasm or justice or love are concepts. If you go looking for sarcasm out in the world, or cut me open, you're not going to find sarcasm in there. Doesn't mean sarcasm's not real. Likewise for humor, or love, or any of these other high-level abstractions. Rights are a high-level abstraction. So there's an in-here element, there's a mind element to rights, but that does not mean that they are subjective. It does not mean they're just made up. Why? Because what they are is they're a recognition, that's the in here part, of a fact. What's the fact that they're recognizing? The fact we were just talking about, the fact that in order for human beings to live as human beings, they must be free to act on the thing that makes them human, their reasoning minds. This is what rights are. They're not mystical. They don't come from God, they don't come from government, and they don't come from nature we know not how. They come from nature in a way that we do know how, at least if you know if you understand Rand's theory of rights. which is essentially what we're talking about here. Now, look, I'm giving you a shotgun version of Rand's theory. There's a lot more to this, and I recommend that you read her works on this. She's got an article titled Man's Rights, another one titled The Nature of Government, another one titled Collectivized Rights, and those 3 essays together will give you, so Man's Rights, The Nature of Government, and Collectivized Rights are the 3 main essays of hers that I would recommend in this regard. I've written an essay titled Ayn Rand's Theory of Rights, which you can find just by Googling it, which integrates a whole lot of her ideas and then concretizes them with a bunch of examples. You may find that helpful as well. But what I'm giving you tonight is just a cursory indication of what she has here. And it's a big deal if you think about it. How much stronger would the liberty movement be if everyone in the liberty movement could say, yeah, rights are real, we understand what they are, they're factual, they're identifications of the factual requirements of human life in a social context. They prohibit people, morally prohibit people, from using force against others. Why? Because when force is used against people, they can't live as human beings. That's why it's morally wrong to do it, because it stops them from being what they are, from living as the kind of thing that they are. It's a fact. So there's an in here part. Very important, yes, they're made, because this is what the utilitarians will come back and say, you're just making this stuff up. It's just a word you made up. You just say, I can't use force against you. Yes, it is a concept, it is an abstraction, and in that sense, it is made up, just like every other abstraction is made up, where every word I'm using right now is made up in that sense. But if an abstraction identifies a fact in reality, that's what objectivity is. It's the relationship between the mind and a fact. And what we have here is what you can call an objective theory of rights to distinguish it from the other theories. God-given rights theory, government-granted rights theory, natural rights that somehow come from nature, we know not how, or are actually supernatural rights, because in the history of natural rights theory, unfortunately, almost invariably, when people talk about natural rights, they are actually talking about supernatural rights. They've just removed it by a step or 3. So what I like to do is refer to Rand. If natural rights theory in history had not done that, I think natural rights would have been a perfectly good term for what we're talking about here. But I think a better term is objective, because what it means is very specific and very accurate. Objectivity is the relationship between the mind and a fact. If I say, did you hear that? You guys go, yeah, I heard that. And the word heard and I heard that, all those words in there are objective because you're identifying a truth, right? And that's what it means to be objective, just at the most fundamental, simple level. But this is true of all of our concepts. For a concept to be objective, for an idea to be true, that means that it corresponds, the idea, the in here part, corresponds to something in reality. And this isn't new with Rand. This is an Aristotelian idea. This is the whole business of the correspondence theory of truth. And that's what we have here. We now have a new theory of rights that is essentially, rights are recognitions of the factual requirements of human life in a social context. What is it we're recognizing? The fact that when people use force against each other, it stops them from living as human beings. It was really hard to discover this theory. I think it took a very, it took a brilliant philosopher building on the shoulders of giants. She built on John Locke, and she built on Aristotle and several other philosophers in between to get to this understanding. We have this understanding now, but only a handful of people on the planet get it. That's where we are in the history of philosophy on this issue. Only a handful of people on the planet get this at this point. And we need this theory if we're going to win the battle for liberty. Because you can't fight if you don't have the moral case for liberty, you don't have the case for liberty. If you're just fighting with economics, it's like, hey, well, if you have free markets, all the boats rise, that kind of stuff. It's true. I'm not against making economic arguments. I don't mean to mock economics, but it's necessary, but it is not sufficient to argue economically. And it's necessary, but not sufficient to argue historically. You can't just go, well, look, we tried socialism and communism, and it gave us rivers of blood and mountains of corpses. Yeah, and we still have politicians and intellectuals in America today advocating it again. Why? Because they think they have the moral high ground. And the reason they think they have the moral high ground is because the liberty movement and the freedom movement don't understand that we have the moral high ground, because we don't understand that we have the moral concept of rights anchored in reality. And if we have that, it changes everything. So I'll end with just, and we'll have Q&A after this, but I'll end with just this. I urge you to learn more about this theory and challenge it. Read Rand and read her critically. I always tell people, if you're going to read Ayn Rand, for goodness sake, anytime you're reading a philosopher or a thinker of any kind and you feel like, wow, this is really making sense, I think you should actually turn up your antenna about whether or not this is true, not turn it down. You should turn it, that should be like a red flag. Whoa, am I getting swept into something here that's not genuinely supported by evidence? So when I say to read Rand critically, I really mean this. And if she were here, she would be championing this very idea. It's central to her philosophy is the principle of independence, which means you should go by the judgment of your own mind and not accept ideas that don't make sense to you. So read her ideas, read them critically, and see if they make sense to you. See if this theory on investigation really makes sense to you. And if it does, start using it. Start using it in your own thinking and start helping other people to learn this theory, because this is how we win the future for freedom. All right, thank you.